Good morning and welcome to Sunday morning Bible class from Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kitchener, Ontario. It's good to have you with us, whether you are following us in real time as part of the live stream this morning or whether you're tuning in a little bit later in the week as we continue our journey through the Old Testament book of Esther, the only book of the Bible that does not make any overt reference to God, to prayer, to any number of other things that are kind of part of just about every other book of the Bible. But nonetheless, a book where God is very, very much at work, and we're going to get right into that here this morning as we unpack in due time Esther chapter 4. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping, as we typically do here at the beginning of Bible class. If you are watching at home and you want to download the lesson sheet for this morning, that's available at the church website, and you can go there now and you will see the button for downloading the class notes. It's right under the button for live streaming. And I'll say right off the bat here this morning that this is one of those classes where I really regret that we are not able to have a larger group of people here in the building because there are certain points of the class today that really, I think, lend themselves very well to some group discussion. And unfortunately, because we're so severely restricted in terms of the numbers of people we can have in the building, that's not possible. So if you have any questions, and I'll take a little bit more time than usual today, or ideas come up in your mind as we talk about some of the things that are in the material for today, please feel free to shoot me an email. And I have my phone here with me, and we will check the emails pretty regularly to see if there's any comments that have come to us, and try to respond to those as best we can. Now, I know that some of you are just getting that second cup of coffee, getting yourselves comfortable and trying to get yourselves organized to go into Bible class mode here this morning. So to give you just a moment to do that, I've curated again this week a number of slides that caught me and that I thought were kind of funny. You may or may not think they are, but we'll continue a little series that we began a couple of weeks ago on the new levels of stupidity that are reached each and every week as we go through this time of pandemic. Someone somewhere has developed a mask that simply covers your nose so that you can eat in public. That's just tremendous. I have no idea why you would want to do that. Oh, my little magic pen isn't working this morning. Oh, well. Another thing that's always a fascination for me is signs that don't exactly communicate as clearly as people might want them to communicate. I think I know what they were trying to say here, but it certainly is open to some speculation. People eating, oops, what's going on here? Why is this? Okay, I want it as a pen. There we go. People are eating children in this area. Well, that's not what they meant to say. But anyway, so at any rate, leash up your dog and clean up after them. All right. And a couple weeks ago, like a lot of folks here in Ontario, I took my car in to get the winter tires taken off, get an oil change done, and I was informed there's a whole new way of doing oil changes now, that the best way to get all that oil out is to give the car a good firm squeeze, and then all the oil comes out of the car. Not saying that's the best for the car. There, my pen's working again. Very good. All right, and then finally, and this is my personal favorite of all of the images that I've culled through this week. You might wonder, do I actually do any work? Yes, I do. But anyway, next one is more of a public service announcement in the sense that next weekend is Victoria Day, which is a holiday weekend here, and then hot on the heels of Victoria Day, sometime in June, I have no idea which date it is, but I know it's coming, is Father's Day. and people want to always shop something nice for Dad. And I think I found a very bargain level item that will be one of the most unique gifts any father could receive this year. Some pants. Let's see here. And I don't know that you can really see this on the screen, but I need to slip my glasses off so I can actually read it here. Patterns galore and colors aplenty. Yes, sirree. For $14.95 somewhere back in the day, you could buy double knit pants for trill, and you could also get some of these really special shoes that go with it too. And some of us in the building this morning are old enough to remember when that ad was, maybe we should look at getting that. But as you can see by looking at me in the lower corner of the screen and looking at this guy, there are certain differences between us then and now. And I'm not sure that, mind you, some people may still have this stuff in their closet, because the one good thing about Fortrell and double knit pants is they never, ever, ever wore out. You couldn't kill those things. Anyway, all right, that's a little fun for this morning. Let's get into the story of Esther. As we're going to pick up a few loose ends, first of all, from last week. Here's the website information again and the email address if you missed it the first time. And now into what we talked about last time. Just to give you a really quick summary, 2-minute summary of the material from last time. You may recall we began near the end of chapter 2, where Mordecai, who is Esther's cousin and guardian, uncovers a plot against King Xerxes, manages to get word to Esther, who gets word to the king, who takes the appropriate action for that time and executes the would-be executors, and survives that moment of nervousness and fear. And then the story took a rather unexpected turn in Esther chapter 3, where the king decides to honor a man named Haman. And Haman is to use the term I learned back in high school English, he's the antagonist in this story. He is the enemy. He's the bad guy. And he is honored by the king. And we're not sure why he's honored. We're not sure whether he's honored instead of Mordecai, or whether there's no relationship really at all between the two things that have happened here. And at any rate, he's honored. But that causes a question of conscience for Mordecai. Because Mordecai is Jewish, and because Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites, because Haman follows other gods, we're not exactly sure all of why it happens, but what happens is that Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman, refuses to acknowledge him as being the one that the king has elevated to this new level of being second in charge of the kingdom. And Haman is, of course, offended at that. And he seeks then to not only destroy Mordecai, but also to destroy all of the Jewish people. He knows that Mordecai is a Jew, and that there are many Jews throughout the empire. Why? Because they have been brought there during the time of the Babylonian captivity. They had been sent home, or many had been allowed to return home decades before, but there's still a large number of Jews who have lived their entire life in the kingdom and are quite happy to remain there. Perhaps were born there, and they've made their whole life there, and they're not motivated to go back to Judea again and begin life all over. And so there are hundreds of thousands of Jews at very least, and he unleashes a plot to have them exterminated. And he selects the day by casting lots. It will be a day 11, nearly 12 months into the future. he goes and he gets the blessing of the king to take this action, and then the edict is issued. And then we are given this summary statement at the end of chapter 3 that the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. And then where we took the discussion last week, and we'll just spend a couple quick minutes going over a few thoughts from that came from last time, is how, sadly, this was not the first and certainly not the last attempt in the history of the world to wipe out the Jewish populations in certain areas. And we talked openly last week about how Luther himself had some rather unsavory ideas and downright hateful ideas about Jewish people. And a number of you dialogued with me during the week about that, and I'm thankful for that. As the week went on, a few more emails came, and I hope that discussion was helpful. Like I say, it's one of those things that we 500 years later, how do we deal with that? How do we understand that not everything Luther said was specifically the Christian thing to say? And someone even asked the question, if Luther had lived today, would he have been canceled for some of this? And I had to think about that a little bit, because that is the way sometimes today, unfortunately, I think, that we handle people who have views that are not really part of the, where society wants to go. And in some instances, it's certainly good that we distance ourselves from individuals whose actions or words do not reflect basic Christian standards of behavior or belief. But Luther didn't live in that kind of time, and I always think it's important that as we look at historic figures, we judge them not so much by the time we live in today and the sensitivities we have today, but by the world in which they lived. And one of the realities of the world in which Luther lived was that, as odious and disgusting as his ideas were about Jewish people, he was certainly not the only one to have them. And we're better, I think, to say, yeah, he said this stuff, own it, but then also to be very clear that this is not what we as Lutherans particularly believe, that he was not inerrant, he was not 100% infallible and divinely inspired in everything that he said. He uncovered the gospel. That was his gift to the church, and that he, like all the rest of us, had parts of him that were not quite as easy to look at and easy to accept, and that we acknowledge that too, that he was a sinful man, and some of that sinfulness in him was an extreme bias against, in this case, Jewish people. He had the same bias against other people as well. He wrote some hymns that we've brought over into English and had to clean up the words considerably, because what you could sing in a hymn 500 years ago about the murdering Pope and Turk aren't things that we probably should be singing about in church today. He was a man of his time, and to judge him by his own time and not by our time, and to take some of these things that he wrote that are unsavory and unpleasant, and to certainly use them in ways that to try and use that to prevent us from making similar kinds of errors, because history does repeat itself. People do get strange ideas, and people do say all kinds of horrible things about other people. Just take a quick look here and see. No, we haven't gotten any controversy yet. The other way I wanted to take this, and we'll just talk this very, very briefly here this morning, because I do want to get into Esther chapter 4, is that, and this was on the lesson sheet for last time, is that Christians too have to endure persecution. in this world. It's a reality that has been around as basically as long as Christ, ever since Christ came into the world, beginning with the murder arranged by Herod of the innocent children of Bethlehem. Followers of Christ have had to endure waves and waves of persecution. And like the people of Israel, the Jewish people in Esther, much of that is, we would believe, unjust, unfair, just singling Christian people out because of their confession and no other reason. To the point that some 260 million Christians today live in nations, and there are about 50 of them in the world, that are very much into persecuting Christians for what they believe. And these 260 million, which you stop and think about it for a minute, that's several times the population of Canada, that these people are enduring persecution on a daily basis for what they believe, or are at least open to being persecuted. And some of the top countries in the world for that are places like North Korea, Afghanistan. There's quite a long list, actually, of places where Christians are persecuted, and even includes some countries that are nominally at least Christian. I was surprised, for example, to see Ethiopia, a country that I've been to, a country where on just about every street corner you'll find an Orthodox Coptic church. But it's also on that list of top 50 countries for persecuting Christians. Why? Because sometimes it's the other Christians who don't belong to that church who find themselves under the oppression of the government. A kind of a strange and bizarre situation. And then on your screen, I've included a picture of a colleague of ours, a man I've met a couple of times from Finland. He is Johanna Paljula. He is the incoming bishop of what they call the Mission Province of Finland. And this man is a conservative Lutheran, a very evangelical, loving, caring man who's a scholar and done some wonderful writing. He himself, just in recent weeks, has been charged with publishing hate literature because of a pamphlet that he wrote back in 2004, or at least he was among the group of people who wrote it, in Finland, that was arguing for continuing to define marriage as the union of one man, one woman, for life, the traditional biblical understanding of marriage. And now in 2021, many years later, he and the other authors have all been charged with disseminating hate literature. The ironic thing about all of this is that Finland itself did not change its own marriage laws until just 5 years ago in 2017. But now what they have done is they've kind of retroactively gone back to a document written, 13 years before that and said, well, that's now hate literature, and are charging the authors with writing it. Now, no one knows exactly how this case is going to go, but we are all watching it rather closely, because it just doesn't seem on the surface to be fundamentally just or correct to charge someone for writing something 13 years ago. At any rate, it just doesn't make any sense. But that, in the world today, persecution doesn't often make sense. And so as time goes on, I think, and the scriptures are clear on this, the church will face more persecution rather than less, and we will join with the martyrs who are under the altar in Revelation chapter 6 and cry out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? How long, O Lord, will you let this persecution or the various persecutions of your people continue? And as we journey through this world, we need to always be looking to the cross because it's there on the cross that God took the ultimate persecution. There, the utterly innocent one, the one who had committed no sin, who was not a racist, who was not in any way, shape, or form any of the isms that we today define as being wrong. He took on himself all of that and all of the punishment and persecution for us. He took it upon himself to be with us there and took it upon himself for us. So even when we are attacked, when it's our turn to be victimized and to suffer from the evil plots of others, where we wonder what God is doing in it all, we know this: He is working. The cross assures us that God is with us even when we can't feel it. The cross assures us that God's redemptive purposes, God's work of bringing salvation, is greater than the evil being done. We read that last week in the gospel reading, Jesus telling his disciples, "You'll have trouble in this world, but take heart, I have overcome the world." And as we look in faith toward the cross, our hearts are lifted so that instead of being filled with anger, we're filled with grace, hope, and even forgiveness. So that brings to a bit of a close some of the things that we were talking about last time. We managed a few questions here. Let's take a moment here, and I'll just take a quick read. Okay, this is an unrelated question about when did Lutherans begin to be referred to as Lutherans. Somewhere in the 1530s, but I'll check and get back to the person with an exact date. They were up to then known as, at first, as Protestants. Lutherans are the first Protestants, if you will, because we were protesting. Yes, another comment. Could some of Luther's opinion be because he tried to convert the Jews and failed? Absolutely, there's a connection there. Early in his ministry, Luther was very big on that. Once the Jews heard the gospel, once we got all of the tradition and all the mess out of the way, and they got to hear the gospel finally in its purity, they would convert. And when that didn't happen, he got mad at them. And again, I don't think that's the right response, but it puts it into a context in his own life. Yes, absolutely. All right, back again here. We got one more. We're really going on. Sometimes, as comment made here, that as we go through life and we experience unpleasantness directed at us, it builds our character. And there's a reference to Jordan Peterson, professor at the U of T. That's also right out of the Bible, from Romans chapter 5, where suffering builds perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope, and hope does not disappoint us. I haven't quoted that exactly, but even in our sufferings, we know that God is at work, and that's actually a very good segue over into what we're going to talk about now, because that's exactly the sort of thing that begins to happen in Esther chapter 4. So let us, without further ado, move into the 4th chapter of the book of Esther. So if you haven't got your Bibles out yet, this would be a good moment to find the Bible and open it up, and we will begin. The story begins, chapter 4, with Mordecai. And Mordecai is set here in contrast to what's going on in the palace. If you recall a few moments ago, the king and Haman were sitting down to toast the success of this new plan against the Jews. The city of Susa is thrown into confusion, and Mordecai himself is mourning and grieving. Let's read the first 3 verses of chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and the order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay on sackcloth and ashes. Well, this is how people in that time, and still today in some parts of the world, express their grief. We in North America tend to, and I think Northern Europe tend to, favor the stiff upper lip approach. You don't let anybody really know. You put on a front and kind of keep most of that inside. Not so much in the Middle East, not so much back in the time of the Persian Empire. Grieving was loud, grieving was visible, grieving involved making some changes, the whole rending of your garments, that this is something that tears at you, a kind of almost identifying with death itself. In this case, even though the death hasn't happened, the people are, Mordecai is putting himself through a kind of a death-like experience, or acting out in a certain sense what death is. And he puts on the garments of mourning and the garments of repentance, the garments of shame, sackcloth and ashes, and he and the rest of the people begin to fast. Now, this is a very common Old Testament practice that is linked to times of prayer. And we will see again at the end of the chapter another reference to fasting. And we'll talk about the connection to prayer a little bit more at that time. But here, I think the reason the author wants to do this is to set this in kind of deliberate contrast to what's been going on in the palace. If you recall, in the early chapters of Esther, and again at the end of chapter 3, the palace is this place of festivity and feasting, this place of huge excess of partying and that sort of thing. And then now, as a result of this edict, the palace, outside the palace, there's weeping and mourning. And meanwhile, Haman and Xerxes are enjoying themselves. And this also moves Haman's location. We talked about this a little bit last time. Haman worked in the building that was called the King's Gate, which was the entrance to the temple complex itself. But now he can't go to work there because he's dressed in this way. You didn't dare go to work in the king's palace dressed in a gunny sack with ashes on your head. That was not something people wanted to see there. So he is moved now out into the square, the central square of the city, just outside the palace. And that's where he can present his pleas and his concerns. So a little bit removed, further removed from Esther. And we're going to see that they're going to need the help of intermediaries to communicate with each other. Up until this point in time, he's had some access to her, been able to be in contact with her directly. But now, because of his dress, because he's no longer working in the palace itself, he doesn't have that opportunity. At any rate, Mordecai, that he is this concerned and consumed with his grieving, word of that reaches Esther. Let's read on the next few verses here. When Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain to her. And he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence and beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So a number of things happening there. Obviously, Esther is made known of the situation with Mordecai, that he's greatly disturbed. He's dressing in the sackcloth and ashes out in the public square. Her first attempt is to send him some clothes and get him dressed up. That he refuses. And then he explains to her what is about to happen. And kind of the key word here is what I read in the NIV as the word annihilation. And that's an absolutely perfect translation of the Hebrew word that is there. This is talking about outright, utter wiping out of people on, just totally erasing them from the world stage, if you will. Perhaps the only better word that might be used here that speaks, in our language that we tend to use would be the word genocide. That it's just everybody who's Jewish is now going to be cut off, and everybody who's Jewish is going to die. And so Esther then responds to Mordecai, and didn't take a lot of time here to put this onto a slide, but we'll just read the story here. I think I must have been in a bit of a hurry yesterday or something when I did this. I kind of didn't put a slide here where we should. Anyway, we won't worry about that. So she's been urged to go before the king. Problem is, that's not just something anybody does in that kingdom. You just don't waltz in and talk to the king, even if you're the queen. You need to be invited, you need to be summoned, and you need to be given explicit permission to talk to the king. So let's read what happens. We're in chapter 4, verses 9 to 11. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. She instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception for this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." That kind of explains the obstacle she's up against. As I said, nobody waltzes in to see the king. And nobody, even if you've been invited in to see the king, speaks unless he extends his golden rod in your direction, his scepter, which is giving you then permission to speak to the king. And unlike today, where, if somebody, doesn't, there was great fuss about when Donald Trump, for example, went to see Queen Elizabeth and for whatever reasons didn't follow some of the royal protocol. Well, that got people talking, and made all kinds of gossip about that sort of thing, and some funny jokes on the internet and that sort of thing. And that's the way we handle that sort of stuff today. If you kind of embarrass yourself or don't follow the protocol, you'll suffer the pain of some embarrassment. Not so back in the Persian Empire. You come in there unannounced. Good chance is you're going to leave missing something like your head, or if you speak up without being invited to speak, some similar fate befalls you. And so she's got all this, kind of rules that need to be followed here. And then this kind of last sentence here, 30 days have passed since I was even called to go to the king. Now you might be thinking to yourself, what kind of marriage is that? Where they don't even see each other for 30 days. Well, that's kind of the way the world was back then. Xerxes still had his harem. He still, if he didn't want to be with the queen, he didn't have to be with the queen. And he just kind of did whatever pleased him. And if, that was probably nothing unusual. Some people speculate that maybe their marriage was a little rocky, but as the story goes on, I don't think it is. I think it's just kind of one of those things. He lived a kind of a separate life from her, and again, you just kind of, it's maybe not the way we would do things today, but a little more part of the culture and style of things back then. All right, this now brings us, and we do have a slide for this, to the moment of truth in the story, and Esther speaks to Mordecai, and Mordecai now responds back. And if people know anything about, if there's a memory verse, if you will, from the book of Esther that people have hung on to, this is it. We'll read it here in just a second. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. All right, he says, you're a little nervous about going before the king. Haven't been invited for a while. Don't know about that old scepter there. Let me fill you in. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will come from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? For such a time as this. This is the question that Mordecai brings to Esther. And it is for these moments, he believes, that she is able, has been elevated to this position. And what I find absolutely fascinating here is the faith that Mordecai has, the faith that he exhibits in Esther, or in God, really, and ultimately in Esther too. The faith that he has, that God, that first of all, that relief will come for the Jews. That somewhere he believes there is going to be something that will bring relief and will spare at least some of the Jews. But he realizes that for Esther, that relief is not likely to come. She's just in far too prominent a place, far too visible, and that when her Jewishness is discovered, she too will be under the edict, and she too will die. So that she's kind of in, stuck between a rock and a hard place. She may die if she confronts the king. If she does not confront the king, she absolutely will die. And so it is in that confidence that God is going to do something for the people yet, that there is relief, and that Esther may be the one who can bring that about. He utters this sentence that we take to heart yet today. Who knows, but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. We have another question coming in. Yes. Oh, this is a good question. Okay. Somebody references back. Good point here that God is clearly working in the life of Esther and has put her there for this time. And then going back to how it was that Esther became the queen, which, as you recall, involved a kind of a one-night audition. And as I said back at the time we covered that, they weren't probably reading poetry to each other. The audition was probably a fairly carnal sort of thing. And so was it God's will, was it God's plan for Esther to have a one-night stand with the king in order to become queen? And I'll go back to what I said. Did Esther have a choice in this matter? I'll go back to what I said then, and I'm going to stick with that answer. And that is that this is yet another example, again, and there are many, many of them, where God uses even sinful actions of people and works through that. He's greater than sin. And even though this involved a certain tawdriness and seediness and yes, disobedience to a command, God is using that. And His power and His grace are bigger than that. Another example where God, same kind of situation, uses something that happens to someone, or that somebody does, rather, that is sinful, to bring about His good purpose. One of the best other examples is King David himself in the Old Testament, when he has his little affair with Bathsheba. And it's out of that affair with Bathsheba that King Solomon is born, and it is from Solomon that the descendants continue down to Jesus. It is out of that son, born out of an adulterous relationship, that David ultimately gets called on by the prophet Nathan, shows that it's sin, and yet God is at work in that. And this is kind of another one of those examples, I think. And as I said before, a good reminder to us all that even though we're not to go out and sin, when we do sin, God is often, He's bigger than that. And He'll take what happened there and He will make often some lesson, some good, something positive happen in our lives if we're open to letting that take place. So good for bringing that up again, because how she gets to this position, not exactly how things probably should have happened in strict accordance with God's will, but God uses this in spite of her to bring about His good and gracious will, and that's encouragement for us as well. All right, let's move a little forward here, and we've kind of covered this already a little bit. Esther is forced here now to consider if there isn't some unseen hand that is directing the story. And I think here there's a deliberate contrast, again, just as there was with the fasting and the feasting, a very deliberate contrast here in Mordecai's thinking to the thinking of the empire. And in the empire, to determine the day for the execution of the Jews, lots were cast. Totally a somewhat random process till they got what they were looking for. And in Esther's case, more this sense that it's not probability, it's not random, it's not by chance that any of this has happened. There's more to life than the luck of the draw. And it is very much part and parcel of Hebrew thinking to look for God's timing in things. The general Hebrew word for time is a very simple word, eth. It's not a hard word, everybody can say it. But timing in the Hebrew mind wasn't just a kind of an understanding of what time of day is it. Is it 25 to 11 or 10 past 12? That's part of it. They want to know where they are in the overall chronology of the day. But timing in the Old Testament is understanding the appointed time, a time when God seizes the moment, if you will, to do His will. And in the New Testament, this will be developed further because the Greek language, which is the language of the New Testament, has two different words for time. The word chronos, from which we get the word chronology, just the passing of the days, so to speak, and then kairos, the specific time, the appointed time, God's time, if you will. That isn't a New Testament understanding alone, but it is actually an Old Testament understanding, and it comes easily into the New Testament. And there's other moments. We won't go into looking all of these up, but if you wanted to look, for example, at Genesis chapter 6, verse 13, the whole business of Noah building the ark, well, that all happens in God's time. Ezekiel chapter 22, the exile, all happens in God's timing. And then that very famous poem from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, there's a time for everything. And that appointed time, a time for peace, a time for war, a time for sowing, and a time for rending, and all of those sorts of things. And this is the concept that's behind that this is the moment for such a time, an appointed time, as this. All right. Which leads then to the question. And this is the part wherein it would be probably good to be able to have some extended discussion of all of this. But maybe you can ponder this in the weeks ahead and correspond with email if you want about the timing. Why has God placed me exactly where I am right now? In our own lives, we often come to those sorts of moments where, okay, is it an accident that I'm here right now? No. I've had any number of experiences over the years in my professional pastoral life, but also in my personal life, where you realize, maybe not exactly in the moment that it's happening, because sometimes in the moment you're just sort of swept up in the events as they're happening around you, and you don't have time to kind of ponder the bigger picture that's going on. But where later you go, oh, wow, God put me there, and I wasn't there by accident. And Jesus, in a sense, draws his disciples' attention to this when he's talking with them about taking up the cross. That this is the time is always right to take up the cross and follow. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of the Father, and they will repay each person according to what he has done. And again, the disciples are there to, take up the cross. This is the appointed time, Jesus says, and to, in a sense, lose ourselves in what it is that we are being called to do. Paul puts it another way, and I thought of this after I did the PowerPoint and never got time to go back to adjust it again. But Paul, in his letter to Timothy, talks about preaching the word in season and out. Knowing when those times are, but also not being afraid to witness to our faith and to seize the moments that are there. Now, all that said, there have been probably many more moments where I've looked back later and I've gone, oh, I had a great chance there and I blew it. This happens, I mean, we don't need to, we shouldn't be beating ourselves up about that either. We don't, in our humanity, we don't have perfect vision of everything, and sometimes, like the disciples, we get a little overtaken by fear and all of those sorts of things. And Peter's a great example. He had the chance there in the courtyard to stand there with his Savior, and nope, 3 times he found ways around that. And who's Jesus goes to him, after the resurrection to say, hey, feed my sheep. Let's move on. Let's keep going forward. And that's what God does. He even takes, as I said before, a moment of failure to make us I'm looking at, I have a brain that can do one thing at a time, and I should stop multitasking. I'm trying to read an email and talk at the same time. That never works for me. Absolutely never works for me. Just to comment back that how comforting it is that when we stumble in sin, God is there that we're reminding us that even though we fall, we're still worthy by Christ, and absolutely, yeah, that's the point I'm trying to make here too. All right, so what does Esther do? We'll just take just a quick minute. We're near the end of our time here, but this part goes pretty quickly here. Esther seizes the moment. She, for the first time in the story, becomes the active player. Up to now, she's been the passive one. Mordecai took her to the harem. The officials in the harem got her ready for the king. The king made his choice. She didn't choose him, he chose her. And she didn't know about what was going on in the kingdom until Mordecai tells her. But to quote Shakespeare, she screws her courage to the sticking point, if you will, and decides that she is going before the king. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. And here fasting comes up again, and I would argue could just as easily be the word pray for me. Because fasting and prayer were so intimately woven together. Don't eat for 3 days, night or day, and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. And with that, we will bring our lesson to a close for today and go forward next time into the intrigue. We're going to find out that Esther, even though she's been passive up to this point in time, when she gets to set together a plan, she's a mastermind and outfoxes the fox, if you will. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that in spite of our failures, you keep using us. Help us to be aware, as Mordecai was, of the times in which we find ourselves, that we would know that you have placed us in positions at certain times for very specific reasons, and give us courage, as you gave to Esther, to seize those moments, for it is, in many times, for such a time as this, that you have placed us in certain situations. Bless us now and to be with us as we worship you, giving you all glory and honor and praise through Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, same time next week. God's blessings.